Joining us for week 3 of the Beginner's Guide to Renovating. With me tonight is Michael Tyrell from Building Approvals and Advice. So Michael, can you tell us a bit about yourself and what the role of a building certifier is?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks so much for having me, Matt. So I'm Michael, I'm the director here at Building Approvals and Advice. We're a specialist certification company based in Brisbane. We work with Jamin Design Group and we've been working together for the last 8 or so years. So we really get what Jamin and the team are trying to achieve, which is amazing designs. And I've been really lucky to work on a number of their projects, so it's been awesome. So from a little bit about my background, I'm a structural engineer, but then I've actually retrained as a certifier. So my specialty is buildings and the built environment, and really understanding what makes buildings safe and how we can ensure that those buildings are built to the codes so that they're functional, but they're also safe for the users. So that's been really my big background, and my passion is around safety, and our whole team at BA&A are really interested in that side of the built environment. So certifiers basically used to work for the council. So it's something that's come, it has been a bit of a change over the last 20 years. So the profession of certifiers is actually building surveying, but the function that we're providing at the moment is of a certification. So we certify that the building is actually built correctly and that it's been built by competent people.
Right.
So our biggest aim is to ensure that our part of the process will make sure that at the end of the job, that not only can the people live there in a beautiful, lovely new house, but it's also safe and that it also meets all of the codes that we have here in Queensland.
Yeah, so the codes then, I suppose a little bit about them, because it's not just one code, there's multiple codes and standards and legislations that you guys need to assess things against and have a knowledge of. And
exactly. So last week we heard from Peter, we're going to hear from Peter again later on tonight, and she really set the scene around the council regulations. So the town plan is basically, it changes in every single council. There is a standard format to it, and there's some similar guidelines, but essentially in Brisbane we have one set of rules, in Moreton Bay we have another set of rules, so we've got to be across all the different rules for the local authorities. So that's sort of step one.
Yeah.
There's also state rules. So we have Queensland guides, which is the Queensland Development Code. We then also have Queensland legislation, such as the building regulations and the Building Act. And then we also have national codes. So that's the NCC, the National Construction Code, and also the Australian standards. So working out which ones are a priority is actually half of our job, so that we know what's actually relevant on that particular site, because obviously every site's different. And what we've got to try and do is work out what code is relevant, and then work with the building designers to ensure that that those codes that are relevant have actually been designed that the house or the extension has been designed to meet those codes.
Yeah, and I suppose that highlights your importance to the design team, because as the designers, we have to deal with a whole lot of issues. We can't be experts on what you're experts on. So we get your expertise in to look at our drawings and say, you need to consider this, this, and this, and this, and this is the outcomes that you need to meet. These are ways that you can do it.
Yeah, exactly. So I think, although we're not part of the design team, because the certifiers are ensuring the safety, we really look at the process, and we're involved across the whole process. And one of the things that we've got as part of our takeaway packs today is the first things that we check. So if we went through every single thing that we checked, we'd probably be here for 3 weeks. But what we thought we'd do is look at what are the first 10 things, and then also a bit of a jargon busting session, because the built environment can be full of different terms that everyone in the industry understands. And so if there are owners out there who are doing this for the first time, or even if you've done it a number of times, you're going to be coming across different terms that the builder and the architect and the building designer might be throwing around, and you might not feel comfortable with it about asking those sorts of questions. But I always think if you can ask the question at the beginning, then you'll be in a much better position as you go through. So
Yeah, definitely. Also, I think there's some terms that we use in the industry that mean something completely different to someone outside of the industry.
yeah, no, exactly.
Yeah.
And the way that it's used, unfortunately, within legislation can change.
Yeah.
So it's not an easy, it's a bit of a minefield, effectively.
Yeah.
But what we try and do at BANA is to educate building designers, educate builders, so that when they're actually looking after your projects, they actually know exactly what they're doing. And we think that if it's great design, equals an opportunity for the builder to be able to get it right on site. And that's why we love working with amazing designers like Matt and Jamin that get those concepts onto the plans, and then they can actually be assessed, but also you understand what you're going to be getting. And I think that's something that we see a lot of projects every month.
Yeah.
But if the owner understands what's going to be achieved, I think, and understands those expectations right at the beginning, I think it makes for a very smooth process.
Yeah, sure. So I guess that's a good time to start on your...
So the first thing that we look at relates to the class of the building. So today, and the series that we've been talking about so far has really been around houses. So houses are actually class 1A. And then we also have ancillary structures and ancillary buildings, which are class 10.
So that's things like a shed or a carport or something like that. Yeah.
So something non-habitable versus something habitable.
Yeah.
So all the commercial buildings are class 2 to 9. And so when we're looking at what we're going to, what structure and how the process is going to go, you really need to understand what type of class the building is first. And so you might hear people talking about a class 1 or a class 10 or a swimming pool, which is a class 10B. So there's lots of different classes, but predominantly the things we're going to be talking about today are related to the domestic side of things.
Yeah. And it has its own volume in the building code, and really because houses and things like carports and that are completely different from commercial buildings in terms of the safety and the habitability that the government's trying to enforce.
Totally unique amongst the two. So the first thing we know when we're looking at an extension to an existing dwelling is that it's going to be a class 1, and there might be some elements that are class 10.
Yeah,
that's good. The next thing we look at is whereabouts is it based, because like we said earlier, if we're in Brisbane City Council, it's going to be a totally different set of rules to Moreton Bay, to Redlands, to Ipswich. So even though we have state legislation and we've got national codes, we still need to know on that granular level whereabouts, which regional council we're looking at. So I think that's, for us, we work in South East Queensland, so we're based in Brisbane, we work in Moreton Bay, all the way down to the Gold Coast, and then out to Ipswich. So I think you need to work with people that know their background, because all these things are changing quite rapidly, to understand it in a lot of detail, and talking to the building designers that actually, have each of the different suburbs even, I think in Brisbane, have got different, although they've got different planning schemes, they've also got different fields. So I think it's really important to work with people that have done amazing work in those areas.
Yeah, definitely. The experience is only going to make things easier for everyone.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So council is pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
The next thing is around the zoning, which I think Peter spoke about last week, which just allows you to know what you can build in those areas. So we actually had a project where a house was in an industrial site, so they couldn't do any extensions. It wasn't something that was going to be possible. So 99% of the time, the zoning is going to be appropriate for the housing.
Yeah.
The other thing that we look at is easements. So it's something that when you're buying a house, you should possibly be aware that there are easements on the property. One of the first things that we check is the site clear of easements? Are there any encroachments? Is there anything that we can tell from a survey plan that will actually stop the whole site being used?
Yeah. So do you want to just maybe give a quick layman's explanation of what an easement is?
So if you're looking at a block of land, and normally the block of land is rectangular.
Yeah.
There may be a portion of the land, again, generally it's rectangular, that you can't actually use for your own purposes. So somebody has taken out an easement, and that easement might be volumetric, so it might be up to a certain height, or it could be clear to the sky. So we see it all the time for services.
Yeah.
So if a large stormwater pipe is running across the property, there's a good chance there's going to be an easement across it. And in that case, you can't actually build inside that easement until you've got written permission from the owner of the easement.
Yeah.
So what we're looking at is what are the restrictions on this particular site. And that's where we sort of start building up the profile of the individual site, because although all of the codes are all the same, how you apply them and which codes are applied is really the critical part.
Yeah.
So an easement would mean that it may change the size of the building, it may change what you can build on the site. So just a really important thing for us to check right at the beginning. Which then leads us on to the next one, which is services.
Yeah.
So they go hand in hand because a lot of the time the services are actually inside the easements. But what we're looking for here is sewers, stormwater, anything that might stop us from being able to build in that area. There are particular codes associated with it, and those codes in Queensland are the Queensland Development Code. So there is one particular code that looks after the building over sewers and building over stormwaters.
Yeah.
But the biggest things that you've got to be aware of is that because the ground has actually, a lot of the time it's been dug up, a pipe has been put into it and then it's been backfilled, it can have an impact on the engineering. It can have an impact on what you can build, where you can build it, where the sewer connection is. So again, it's one of those, understanding what's on the site will give you that really good grasp about what 50% of the time that they're crossing a block, especially when you see a block high at the street and it's falling away from the street. 9 times out of 10, when we look, we do a lot of pools at BANO. When we look for a person wants to build a pool in the backyard, all of a sudden there's a sewer across the middle and it impacts on what you can build.
Yeah.
So really looking out for, and you can do the free search. There's actually a dial before you dig search that you can do to understand whereabouts these sewers and stormwaters are. And then once you know where it is, that's when you can start to get a bit more information. So we'll use programs like the Brisbane City Council eBIMAP to do drill down reports, to understand the diameter, the depth, the invert level, just so we're really clear about where it is and what we can do.
Yeah, and then that covers existing services, but there's always times where you may need to add services in. You may need to put a manhole in and things like that. So that will have further implications on I guess how you can and where you can build on the site.
So anything to do with subdivision, anything to do with new water supplies. We had a recent project where the owner wanted to put the where the owner wanted to put a pool, there was a sewer jump up, so they needed to change where the sewer jump up was.
Yeah.
Now that can be 10 grand. So unless there's a really, and in the scheme of things, if it's $1 million build, then $10,000 might be worth it to get the right spot and the right pool. But what we always suggest is if you know that right at the beginning, then you don't need to change the design because you've actually got that information. What we hate to see is a beautiful design and then because of something that is an overlay or it's because of an easement, they can't actually get what they're looking for. I think that's when owners can be a bit disappointed with the process. So that's why this is what we always check right at the beginning.
Yeah, and apart from the dial before you dig information and the BIMAP information that you guys have a subscription to, I suppose that highlights the importance of having a land survey done on your property at the beginning of a job.
We were talking with a structural engineer the other day, just saying how important the surveying is, because if everyone knows where the block is, and that sounds a bit silly, but the fence line might be out by 200-300 mil, the house might have an encroachment, so we always suggest getting an ID survey, understanding where the block is in relation to its neighbours, understanding where the house is, and then also working out where all of the services are, so that you've got a really clear idea. Even the contours make a huge difference, because when you can model it properly right at the beginning, a lot of the decisions that move on from the building design stage then set that design in concrete. And so, eventually, literally, it will be concrete, obviously, But in between, it starts setting up where you can build the building, and a lot of the referrals that either Peter as the planner or ourselves as going through the siting variations, if that information isn't correct right at the beginning, it means doubling back and doing it all over again, which a lot of the time will cost money, but it also costs time. And if a builder's started and they're getting the surveying once they're on site, because at some point it has to be done. It's not like it's not going to be done.
Yeah.
But getting it at the beginning rather than getting it when the builder's on site and realising that, oh, hang on a sec, we can't fit that 6x6 carport in that spot is a very annoying thing for the owners and for the builder, rather than having that information right at the beginning. So I think you're right.
Yeah.
Easements, the services all tie together by getting a survey, a detailed survey right at the beginning.
Yeah. And then I guess just to quickly cover so that we make sure people understand, an encroachment would be anything from someone else's property that's on your land, whether it be a fence or a retaining wall or their eaves at their roof, things like that. So.
Exactly. So typically the way that we look at it is, if you're going to be building something yourself, you need to keep it completely inside your own property boundary. So that includes, even though the dimensions might be to the outermost projection, which is the eave or the wall, depending on which code you're looking at, that doesn't mean that your eaves can then just hang over into somebody else's property, or that your retaining wall can slightly go into next door neighbour's property. Fences are they're not considered building work, and they're covered by a totally different set of legislation. But ensuring that all of the building work is completely contained with your own property will be the last step that we ask for, and that's considered an as constructed survey. So if you get it right at the beginning and it's inside your property when it's set out with some tolerances, and then at the end of the project it's all inside your property boundary, then you won't have the issue of encroachments.
Great.
Which is great, because they cost a fortune and they don't add any value, that's for sure.
Yeah. Okay, so we've covered up to services, so...
Yeah, so the next thing really relates in with Peter's topics of overlays. Now, for certifiers and in the certification process, a lot of the time the overlay is the item that stops it from being self-assessable. So as a general rule, the council believes that if the zoning is correct and it's zoned for a house, and you want to build a house in that zone, then it should be self-assessable.
Yeah.
The issue is overlays can push it out of self-assessable because of a certain risk or because of a certain character. So what we've got to be sure of is, does the work that we're proposing fit inside the requirements of the Brisbane City Council via those overlays?
Do you have an example?
Yeah.
Perhaps?
So a good example is in Moreton Bay. Is bushfire. So if the local authority have designated that site is covered by bushfire, then not only do you have to comply with the Australian standard AS 3959 for how to build in a bushfire area, but you also have to comply with the RADs for the local authority to ensure that all of the elements related to bushfire, and there's a number, including having access around the house, having water for the bushfire bushfire fighting, length of driveways, all that sort of thing. We need to make sure that all of those comply before we can go to the next step. So you don't actually have a town planner on every project, because not all the time it doesn't actually need a town planner, but the town plan is there for every single project. And so what the certifier will do is, if they're unsure, then they'll actually get advice. So they'll go to the planner or to the council and say, we've interpreted this in this particular way, have we understood it correctly? So I had one the other day where, although it was a patio, the bushfire overlay code pushed it from being self-assessable to being accessible. And I had to just double check with council that because the driveway was existing and it was more than 100 metres, would that still be a trigger? And it was. So we've just got to make sure that all of those overlays, and there's flooding, so a lot of them are to do with risk, bushfire, flooding, landslide, but then some of them are to do with our traditional heritage. So what we're going to build and how we're going to build it is really important as well. So the overlays are the the ways that you can understand what you can build on that particular site via the town plan.
Yeah. Okay, that's a good explanation.
So the next thing is each of our rules are associated with very specific guidelines. So the next one is about block size. So depending on whether your block in Brisbane is less than 450 square metres or more than 450 square metres, they're two totally different sets of rules. So what will happen quite a bit is people will remember rules and remember that, I remember I can't do a double carport on that particular block, or I can't do this on this particular block. But the issue is there's so many rules and so many regulations that we need to know what the trigger is. And so in this case, the trigger for knowing what we can do is actually the block size.
Yeah.
So in Brisbane, under 450 square metres, we go straight to the town plan. And over 450 square metres, 450 square metres and over, we go to QDC MP 1.2. So the big difference there is if the siting complies, so where you want to put your carport or where you want to put your extension, if it complies, then we know that we can keep going as a certifier can approve it. Where the issue is if it doesn't comply, that tells us who do we need to go to next.
Sure.
Would we go to a town planner like Peter, or would we go to council for the siting variation side? So they seem like arbitrary rules, but the rules are there because of the size, because of the dimensions, and because of the standard that we have in Brisbane, so that then people know that if they were to build today, then it's going to be consistent, that it's going to make sense with our urban design.
Yeah.
So I think it's a really important one, but sometimes it can be lost, and understanding why, I think is really important.
Yeah, and probably something that's becoming more and more common as we get smaller lot sizes across Brisbane, and people subdividing their typical 8, 10 lots into 2 405s, or we're starting to see lots around the 250 square metre size as well in some areas.
Yeah, and I think some of those older suburbs are used to having quite narrow, long, thin blocks. I think the challenge for building designers and architects is to really get what can be built there, and then use it for a modern Australian family.
Yeah.
Just so that it really matches. But the constraints are real. Like you need to know those rules right at the beginning, and once you've got the rules, then you can really work out what your design can be. But those are changing as well. So we are starting to see a lot of duplexes and in some areas really narrow blocks, like you were saying, and a little bit more like Melbourne or Sydney or the UK, where they're actually terrace houses with joined walls, which we just haven't really seen in Brisbane before. So there's definitely some changes as well, which is great. Okay, so we talked about block size. The next one's really about houses, and so the house code itself. So we've got a lot of rules and regulations again, but under the house code, it actually tells us what we can use the house for.
Okay.
And it also tells us how high the house can be.
Yeah.
So when a lot of people are looking at what they're going to do with their house, they really need to be clear that what they're wanting to achieve is actually a Class 1A house. Now, what I mean by that is some of the time people will want to put in a second story, either underneath or above. They'll want to fire rate it, they'll want to rent it out to someone completely independent, and or have two families living side by side. As soon as we start doing that, it actually stops being a Class 1A house, and it also stops being a house by the definition of Brisbane City Council.
Right, yeah.
So really looking at what are we trying to achieve, and so there are certain rules around granny flats that I think if they're pushed too far, it actually changes from one household and having a family living there, which is the normal sense of a granny flat where someone's living with you, to being two independent units. And they might be considered as dual occupancies or as units themselves. As soon as that happens, it completely changes the regulations. So being really clear about what will be acceptable and how the shared facilities of the household are going to work together. I think if people are clear and if people are honest, then I think it works really well because we are having extended families. This COVID-19 has shown us that everyone's being more integrated within the families, but also if people are pushing the limits and not actually wanting to have it as a household, then more than likely council will get involved and they will receive fines. They will have also had to assign a stat dec, so there's all sorts of issues about trying to bypass the regulations. So I think the house code is normally the place that a lot of people will start to look at what they can do with that particular house. So I think it's a really important doc.
Yeah. So in essence, the house code is just to check that it is by definition a house.
Yeah.
And not something broader like the dual occupancy or rooming accommodation or those kind of things.
Exactly. Rooming accommodation is another big one. So that we've squeezed 7 bedrooms and 7 en suites into one building and called it a house. So they're definitely the sorts of things that we'd know, and that's where I think you need to really work with a great architect and great building designer, because they're going to get what's compliant and what you can build right. And if there's ever any questions, everyone works in teams, and that's one of the questions that would come across either to the town planner or to myself about how do we recognise this and what would that be considered under the legislation.
Yeah, I suppose it's sort of the saying that these things are all possible. We just need to have an open dialogue about it and come to a decision on how to make it possible.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So the next thing, which is one of the big things that we've already sort of spoken about it, is the NCC. So the NCC itself is the National Construction Code, also known as the BCA, the Building Code of Australia. Now, this is the book that's related to Class 2 to 9s, and so it changes every 3 years. We're also having amendments outside of the 3-year cycle, and then this book is the one about houses.
Yeah.
So realistically, what we're doing is using this as a recipe guide to say, if this happens, then we can do this. So it's very, it's considered deemed to satisfy, which means that the floor to ceiling height has to be 2,400, or the stair height has to be a maximum of 190 mil. It's all rule based. But what they've changed recently is to say, although we have a heap of rules, what we're trying to achieve is the performance outcomes.
Yes.
And so by looking at the performance outcomes of the code, it gives you a good guidance. It gives you good guidance as to what are we trying to achieve. And effectively, what the NCC is trying to achieve is safe, compliant homes.
I think health is also
exactly
a big part of that safety. There's quite a lot in there just to make sure that there's enough ventilation and natural light and things so that people are living as healthily as possible. Yeah,
so it's definitely about livability as much as it is about practical safety.
Yeah.
But this is where you'd go to your guide for things like smoke alarms, for step downs, for staircases. There's so many specific rules. But what we generally look at is the architectural plans, because although it's documented really well in here, it has to be addressed on a house-by-house basis.
Yes.
And that's where taking all of that information and bringing it into it. Also, inside this, we reference all of the Australian standards. So it's not just this book, which is pretty chunky as it is, but each of the Australian standards that are referenced are actually slotted into this book as well.
Yeah.
So things like AS 3959 is a code because it's referenced in this NCC. So one of the amazing tricks and the gifts that amazing building designers and architects can do is take something as regulated as this and turn it into something amazing. That's where I think when we go through a building and you walk up the stairs and you can actually feel that the stairs are consistent. When you lean against something and it's a balustrade, and you don't feel like you're going to topple over the side, you know, when you look and the amount of natural light and ventilation actually makes you feel happy. There are so many things that this book's trying to achieve, but are actually done by great design. And I think if the great design is carried out first, then a lot of the time it's already covered these things. Like, you know, fire safety makes sense.
Yeah.
Having stable stairs, having handrails, having things that are safe, I think really ties into it. And then what we do is do a sanity check and say, okay, we've seen where the smoke alarms are. We've seen that the stairs are detailed correctly. We know that there's handrails. So all of those elements, including things that the engineer looks at. You know, so the engineer is a huge part of the building design as well. But we'll make sure that those people that are doing all of the work are actually licensed and that they're competent.
Yeah.
So in Queensland, we really rely on the fact that we are regulated. So not only do the building designers and the architects and the board of professional engineers register and make sure that the professionals are competent and doing their job, but all of our trades here in Queensland are also registered. So we know that if someone's gone through their apprenticeship and they've carried out that work, then in Queensland we can actually recognise that and we can accept them as a competent person.
Yeah, and I guess that also gives a bit of a stick to punish people that don't do their job correctly.
Yeah, well, the QBCC look after all of the construction industry. So certifiers are licensed by the QBCC as well as builders in every trade. So if there's ever anything that hasn't been carried out correctly, then QBCC is the first place that people go to make sure that either what they've done is incorrect and needs to be redone, or that they're able to adjudicate and to understand what is the actual requirement.
Yeah.
I think that's important because there's obviously people's homes are very emotional, and you need to make sure that what's being carried out is being carried out by someone who's professional and also someone who knows what they're doing. They're not just a person who's flown in and decided to do whatever they want. So that's why, although the NCC it's a really big volume, when you break it down, it actually makes heaps of sense. But it also means that the building designers, the architects, the builders, and the engineers all know what's our minimum standard.
Yeah, and I think that's another important thing is that the codes are a minimum standard.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yep.
Sorry, we can go beyond that.
Oh, for sure.
You know, especially like things like balustrading or I mean, you know, definitely natural light and ventilation. The requirements are pretty low.
Yeah.
And I know that, you know, pretty much every architect and designer I know will go way beyond that just in what we think is a good design.
Yeah, but it's also a balancing act. You know, making sure that if we're putting in more light and ventilation, that it still has the energy efficiency components. So that's where I think our legislation means that you can live in a house without having ridiculous heating and cooling costs.
Yeah.
You can be comfortable in summer, you can be comfortable in winter. It's a place for you to come that you're going to be able to live in we're in an amazing spot here in southeast Queensland. So by designing to these codes and also the passive designs, it allows us to know that we're going to be, that the house is going to be comfortable.
Yeah.
I think that's a really important part, because if you did have western facing glass and it's absolute heat box, it would be a terrible place to live. But because of the way that the energy efficiency ratings work, it actually models the whole house, so that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
So it's great.
Yeah.
So if we've got the NCC and the Australian standards, the last thing is really around the QDCs. So that's the Queensland Development Codes. So we touched on it a bit earlier, but the Queensland codes can be variations because we're a federation. Not all of our legislation is the same in New South Wales, Victoria, and all the states. So Queensland, like everywhere else, has its own rules and regulations. So some of the QDCs are state variations from the NCC, but then some of them are about trying to achieve uniformity. So QDC MP 1.1 and QDC MP 1.2 are all about where you can put a house on a block of land. So if that is applied, and obviously it can change in local authorities, but if that's applied, and in South East Queensland it's generally adhered to, there are a few changes here and there, but if it's applied, it just means that you know what you're going to get, and you know that you're going to have that space around you, so that you. It's a nice place to live. It looks at the amenity, looks at privacy. You know, there's so many things that the legislation writers look at to make sure that we're going to be living in a great place.
Yeah.
So the Queensland Development Codes also include things like noise corridors and flooding. So that, again, how would the engineers look at designing it in those areas? And also, what are some of the things that we need to look at from a noise point of view, so that we're not going to be uncomfortable in the house. So these first things are all related to codes and checklists and all those sorts of things, but they're basically the basics. Once we start on that, then we can keep going and checking all the other items that we look at. But it's a really good place to start so that you can understand what can be built and what are those constraints.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the constraints, and if you can set them up early, is going to make the design process smoother, and probably avoid expensive issues further down the track.
Yeah, exactly. There's nothing worse than having a completely beautifully designed house with the engineering all done, with the energy efficiency all done, and then realising that there's two 1600 diameter stormwater pipes running straight through the middle of the site.
Yeah.
Number one, you definitely don't want to drill through them because it's going to be a nightmare and you'd have to pay for the costs. But also it means, along with those stormwater pipes, there's generally overland flow. So it might mean that you need a 2.5 metre undercroft to allow for that water to cross the site. So all of a sudden you've gone from a beautiful slab on ground to having a 2.5 metre undercroft. You can basically throw those plans away, throw away the engineering design and start all over again.
Yeah.
So that's one of the big things, that working with industry professionals who actually check these sorts of things right at the beginning is so important, because we've seen a lot of clients that are beside themselves, that they've spent lots of money and lots of time thinking they were building or designing their dream home, and they've been left with just a bill and they've had to start all over again. So that's my sort of the starting point for us. Obviously, we don't just start the process. So certifiers will be involved right at the beginning. Generally, an owner would go to a building designer or an architect first, get some scheme designs. The building designer and architect will always, do their due diligence, check what they need to do. If they've got any questions, they come to the certifier or they come to the town planner or the engineer. But once it comes to us, we'll then start the assessment process. Yeah. And so that's where we start seeing some of the frequently asked questions. Some of the jargon. Yeah. So as part of the pack, we've got the amazing first 10 things that we check, which gives a little guidance around what are those 10 things. But then we've also got the certification terms that you might need to know. And so that's in our downloadable pack that's available now. But we've broken it into two stages. So there's the pre-construction stage, which is where a lot of our work actually happens. Yeah. So as certifiers, we'll do all our checks, we'll do all of the searches, and then we'll open up the codes that are relevant to that particular site. And so the way that we work at BA&A is we'll actually go through, if it is a small lot code, we'll actually download a copy of the small lot code that's current today, and then we'll go through every single one of the items. And we'll cross it out if it's not relevant, we'll mark it green if it's relevant, and then we'll mark it red if it's not accessible, or if it's not self-accessible. Yeah. So if it doesn't comply, we've got a list of exactly why it doesn't comply, and then we can explain that back to the building designers and the architects. Yeah, and then give them a choice of whether they make it comply or they go for the assessment. But one of the things we think is really important is showing people whereabouts in the code it either complies or it doesn't. Yeah. Because I think if people understand the codes, then 99% of people actually want to do it right and they want to get it right. It's just if people are fooled by jargon and the professional isn't willing to communicate properly, then it actually makes the building designer and the builder's work a lot more difficult. So what we want to achieve is really clear communication so that we understand where the information is coming from, and then we can also, then it's the choice of the owner and the building designer to decide whether they want to comply with that or whether they want to change and go through town planning.
Yeah. And then I suppose the certification is similar to the town planning as well as how Peter was saying last week, that there's no precedence in town planning. So for certification, you can't, there's no precedence there. It's complying with the current rules and regulations. So you can't just say, well, my next door neighbour did it, but they might have done it even if it was a year ago and the rules have changed.
Exactly. So making sure, if the precedence for us is that if it's self-assessable.
Yeah.
So the issue is when it's not self-assessable and council have made a decision about something outside of it, that's when we can't judge whether it's going to be acceptable or not acceptable. So yeah, it does get really complicated if we want to go outside, but some of the time the building design requires something different than the self-assessable item. So I think that's where having a good discussion with your architect and building designer is really important to understand, it might take us an extra 3 months, but it's going to be worth it because of X, Y, Z.
Yeah, and then also from your side, the information on how hard that approval is going to be to gain and how long it will take and how expensive it's going to be, so that you can judge, is it worth the expense to go down that route.
No, and we had a client the other day who wanted a 9 metre wide carport right at the front of the boundary, and I said, I've never seen that before. I don't think you're ever going to get it done. I see 6 by 6 and think that's probably the maximum. But getting that feedback, because some of the time people want to push the boundary as much as they possibly can. That's fine. You might not get it approved and you might have wasted your money. But having that discussion, at least if people know, they can make that decision themselves and they can ask council. So I think we're going to have some questions.
Yep, so we're going to pause, get in our other 2 experts. So this is a great time for you to submit any questions that you've got, and we'll be back in a couple of minutes to answer them. Well, welcome back. We are joined by Peter and Kieran again this week for question time. And I believe Peter has a burning question.
I'm dying. I've been sitting in the back of the room going, oh, let me at him, let me at him. Okay, so I thought it'd be great to talk to the process. So basically, long story short, you design a set of plans, you send them through to Mick, you're like the kingpin, you sit there and make sure that everyone else in the process has done what they're supposed to do, so the town planning works, the engineering works, the energy efficiency works. You then hit stamp approved, the builder then goes off, builds the thing, but you come along at various stages and actually check that the work is being done in accordance with those plans. Then at the end you come along and go, yep, happy days, it's all approved, send your plans off to council. That's my simplified version. Do you want to talk to it and go into a bit more detail as to how the process actually works, where you get involved along the way?
I think you've nailed it.
Oh, well, that was easy. Our work's done around.
Just become a certified.
No, I wouldn't take the job. Like you were sitting there before going, yeah, we've got the town plan, we've got NCC, we've got the Australian stands, we've got QDC. I was like, oh, far out. I whinge about the planning scheme. I can't complain.
No, 100%. You nailed it. What you've got to look out for, and what is the devil's in the detail when it comes to building. So, in the conditions, so the DA conditions is something that we will read, and a lot of those DA conditions don't actually have to be met prior to final inspection or prior to occupancy.
Yeah.
So our conditions as the certifier will be different from the town planning conditions. So it will actually specify that you need to do a footings inspection, that it needs to be set out, that it needs to have a slab inspection, that you need your plumbing approval. There are so many different elements inside that package that actually really clearly identify what has to happen once it's been approved. And I think that's the big part for me, is that if you've gone through that package, then you'll know exactly when, exactly what is required, and exactly who you have to give it to. For Queensland, we're guided by the Building Act and the building regulations, so it's really clear when things have to happen, and that's what's driving that whole process. But it also gives us a great way to be able to rely upon the trades that are licensed and the professions that are licensed, so we know exactly who's doing what. And that's our last stage. That's when we're collecting all the certificates. We're making sure that, and a lot of people say, oh, it's just a piece of paper. You're shuffling paper around and whatever else. That's fine, it is a piece of paper.
I get that too. You're not alone there.
But what that piece of paper means is that someone's gone through 4 years of a trade, or they've gone through 7 years of architecture, or they've gone through 4 years of engineering, and they're signing off to say that is correct. So it's not just a piece of paper, it's all of the skill and all of that profession that backs it up. And in Queensland, we recognise that. And I think that's great, that we know that if that person has carried out the wet seal, that they're doing it competently. So we don't have to go, I don't personally have to go and have a look at the wet seal. The engineer does need to visit site, the surveyor does need to visit site, I need to visit site to make sure that it complies. But as we're getting more and more complicated with the town plan, the building designer and the architect have to visit site to ensure that their parts are being met. The town planners will be starting to have to sign off that their conditions have been met. So we're all being drawn in to make sure that, and it's only for the owner's benefit, that whoever's going to be living in it right now or in the future is going to have something that's safe and it's going to be compliant. So we've had a few, very, very, very few. We work with amazing builders and owners that have said, I don't particularly want termite protection, or I don't particularly want to have smoke alarms, or I don't particularly want this or want that. Unfortunately, it's not your choice. The legislation says you need termite protection. So we need to put it in. You need smoke alarms. So there's things that are non-negotiable, and then there's things that are to do with the builder and the owner around contracts. So that's something we won't get involved in. But one thing we do need to be really clear is that at the end of the project, it needs to be complete and it needs to be compliant. So if you're thinking about taking something out of the contract, and I would highly discourage you. But if your mate is the best electrician in town and he's going to do all the electrical work, just be aware that you can't get your house signed off until the electrical work is completed. There are so many intricacies, and it doesn't matter who's doing it. It just matters that by the time we're doing our final, that all of the work is complete and all the work is compliant.
Yeah.
So I think you did a great job. Peter.
What another question? No one else is going to jump me. Okay, so what are some of the biggest mistakes you see, both in plan form that you're always correcting, and also when you physically get to site? Like, for example, when you get to site.
That'd be one of my questions.
Oh, too slow. No, like I'm assuming pool fencing, you always get there and the bars are too far apart, or it's just that bit too low. What are some of the most common things that you're always picking up time and time again? That people can, so you just raise everyone's awareness and consciousness to what can be out there, what the issues can be.
So, because what I always think is, if you work with an expert who does this day in, day out, they know what they're doing. So, surprisingly, pool fencing, for the people that we work with, they know what they're doing and they get it right. So, for us, it's a sanity check, and we're going through, we measure everything. You know, never be concerned if a certified takes out a tape and starts measuring things. That's just second nature to us. So we'll be checking the distances between bars, we'll be checking heights, we'll be checking non-climbable arcs, everything else. But to be honest, the pool builders that we work with actually get it right a lot of the time. The things that we see that are incorrect are when it comes from a change. So I'll give you an example. The NCC changes every 3 years. So when it starts in 2016, and then 10 things might be added to the 2019, for the first 6 months, there might be a lag in between when people are 100% aware of what they need to do for those new changes. So things like having restrictions on windows in bedrooms. If the window sill's less than 1700, although it came in a number of years ago, that's something that I'll always check because it's something that gets missed. Internal to external step downs. A lot of people love flat thresholds. We've got to make sure that we have the internal to external step down.
Makes sense. No one wants that trip hazard.
Yeah, no one wants a trip hazard, but also...
No one likes water coming in.
Yeah.
So
True, touche.
Having water coming into a house is a nightmare. So
Really? I thought it'd be fun. Yeah, super cool.
So internal to external steps. When you because a lot of the time that's when it's a tiled balcony. If you're tiling a balcony, just double check the balustrade height.
Oh, true.
Because I've seen that a number of times. When you have this much thickness and your balustrades are at 1 metre, all of a sudden you put tiles and bedding on it, it's less than 1 metre.
And
So-
black and white, as far as you're concerned, has to meet that limit.
Exactly. There are some things that you can look at a performance solution. Balustrade heights isn't one of them. And that's always 1 metre, and that's the minimum. So some of the time we'll see it where it's quite a long span, and in the middle, I always measure in the middle, you don't measure at the edges, it sags, and if it's under the metre, that's when you need to chop it back up, make sure that it's fixed correctly, just so that, again, it's only a safety thing. So that when you are leaning on that balustrade, you know that you're not going to just topple over and hurt yourself.
Yeah. Did you have any other?
no, that's not good. I just ask what what the most common thing is. Find problems that builders have caused, I suppose.
Yeah.
Or what? Yeah.
Yeah, first flush for so when you've got a house that has all of its water by tanks, making sure you've got your first flush in place under the QDC. I mean there's a few, but to be honest, the people that we work with, like Kieran, they know what they're doing, and if we bring it up,
promotion right there.
All right.
what we love to do is again to educate and to understand why that's happening. So if we can say in the QDC it says you can't have inconsistent stair rises, then once it's fixed, that builder then knows to do that correctly every single time because we've shown where and why it's there. So
Yeah. I've got a question here from the comments that is probably pretty relevant to a lot of people. It's asking about, it's quite a specific question, but with performance outcomes is sort of deemed to satisfy, does that give a bit of flexibility in the minimum requirement for ceiling heights? So especially there's a lot of old Queenslanders where the Undercroft area may have a ceiling height of 2350 instead of 2400.
Yep. So like I said before, these codes
Here's something I prepared earlier.
are performance based. So
I'm just here to throw you off your game.
So what it says under the code is under part 3, it's the deemed satisfied, so it says it has to be a minimum of 2.4 metres. But if you go to section 2 of the NCC, it talks about what are we trying to achieve. So To vary from the DTS, you'll need to get expert opinions. So right at the beginning, it tells you how you can actually use that. Expert judgment by using a fire engineer is probably the best way. They might use expert judgment and the verification method. There's a couple of different options. But effectively, it's possible. I'm not going to say you can do it on every single case. Things that I've seen before is when they increase the number of smoke alarms, so that's early detection. They increase the egress, so that you can get out of those rooms really quickly, especially if it's a bedroom.
So that's your egress is your doors to outside of the house.
Exiting the building.
Yeah.
So what they might be looking at is the performance says you need to be safe. If you're sleeping in a place, you need to have adequate time to be able to get out of the building, because as the smoke starts coming down, you need to still be able to get out. So a fire engineer can look at distances, times, and then they can write a report, which is a performance solution, and give that to the certifier. Once the certifier's read it, and if they agree that that person is a competent person, and they agree with those outcomes, then it can be incorporated into a building approval. But I would definitely talk to the fire engineer, and I would talk to the certifier to see what the additional costs are, and also what that process is, because every certifier is different.
Yeah. And then if you were to sell that house to someone, would you recommend them passing on a copy of that
Performance solution?
performance solution to the new owners?
So under the Form 21, which is our final certificate in Queensland for detached homes, so I'm assuming it's a single detached dwelling, it would actually have in the performance solution, there's a box that says, are there any performance solutions in this property? That would actually be referenced. So that particular fire engineering report would be referenced with the house. Now, if you sell it, great idea to give it to the new owners, because there might be some conditions around maintaining that egress or maintaining those smoke alarms that might be a little bit unusual. So as long as they can maintain it, then they can still use it in the safe way that it was designed.
Great.
I've got one more question, if I can quickly slot it in there. Retrospective approvals, are they possible? Why do you hate them? No.
Yeah, that's a nice short one.
The reason why I don't like retrospective approvals is because I like
Retrospective approval is approval after the work's been done, just clarifying.
and it's because I like to work with professionals who do it right the first time and who go through that process. What I can't guarantee, and I'm not an expert in it, so every certifier is an expert in different areas, but what I can't guarantee is that because we're going backwards through the process, that every step along the way has been carried out to the legislation. So I know if I condition an approval that says the surveyor needs to set it out, the engineer needs to inspect the footings, and then the slab, and then the frame, I know that those elements will be addressed. Whereas if you do it backwards, I'm not actually 100% sure that it's been carried out correctly. And so as a result, if I did do them, I don't, but if I did, I could take a lot of fees for it, and then at the end of it say, unfortunately, I can't actually get it to be approved. So a lot of that is about managing expectations, but also I've got very limited time, and I want to spend all the time that I have working with people who want to do it right the first time and who are professional. So then I know at the end of it that it's a safe, compliant home. And I think for me and my team, it's all about safety. So if I can if I can spend my energy educating and spend my time checking things like that, then I'm always going to be a lot more confident about it. But there are certifiers who do it, and they are experts in those fields. So I'd always suggest, if you do have any existing work, that you talk to them first and you understand what that process is.
Great.
I've got one more question.
Yeah.
I want to know whether to touch base on ownerability.
Yeah.
So,
Although just something, can I talk about this? No.
I was watching the video before. So, but do you look after owner builders, Michael?
No, I don't. Again, we're experts at certain things. So we do pools, we work with professional builders. On our quotes, you'll see this quote is relevant for a QBCC licensed builder.
Right.
Now, the reason we don't do existing work, and even in our engagement agreement it says, is it existing work? Yes, sorry, we can't help you, please talk to someone else. Same thing for owner builders. Now, the reason is almost exactly the same as existing work. We want to make sure that it's complete and compliant. The fact that you've done a trade for 4 years and then had 15 years of experience to make sure that it's correct. And owner builders might not have done that same amount of work.
Yep.
To me, all of these codes and all of these things that we're talking about are extremely complicated.
Yep.
And so the amount of time that I need to be able to spend to do my job properly, I need to spend it with people that are going to do it again and again and again.
Yep.
Because then the time that I'm spending educating and the time that I learn from them as well is really well spent. Whereas, unfortunately, I can't charge enough for me to be able to project manage that project. And if things go wrong, then unfortunately it has to comply with that minimum standard. And so that's the reason we don't do it, and we only ever work with industry professionals.
Good answer.
Great. Well, I think we're out of time for tonight. Thank you, Mick, for all your expertise. Thank you, Peter and Kieran, for your questions. Next week is the final week in this series, and I guess I'm going to be in the hot seat talking about the design process and what we as architects are, the thinking behind what we do and why we do it. So hopefully you can join us next week. Thank you.
Thanks very much.